Hello Year 6 and welcome to today's reading activity. So, your task for today, your job for today, we're going to carry on reading a bit of Macbeth, and then you are going to be looking at the different main events that have happened in the story and how Macbeth has responded to them. So, to help us do that, let's get into my screen. Here we go. Okay, so we are continuing to look at Macbeth, and we're looking at this modern retelling of it by Andrew Matthews. And we're looking at active reading strategies to deepen understanding. So what that means is, as we are reading, we are continuing to pick out information and to look for information to help us deepen it, to help us to get a better understanding of what it is that we're reading about. So we're going to get into the text, but just before we do that, let's have a quick think about what our task is. So today, we're going to read a bit more in a minute, but then you are going to think about the main events in the story. So I'm going to tell you which those main events are. And then for every event, you are going to think, what did Macbeth do in that? Okay, so what did he think? What kind of was his response to it? And then also, what does this tell us about Macbeth? So be thinking about that as we're reading through these next events. So going into the story, King Duncan is dead. Okay, and it looks like Macbeth has done it, and he brings back these two daggers that are covered in blood. Ugh. And his wife, Lady Macbeth, goes, "Why have you brought them here? You need to go and take them back to make it look as though the guards did them." And Macbeth is kind of just in complete shock about what's just happened. He doesn't really understand about what he's just done. He's kind of just so confused. And then the last line just that we finished with on Friday was that him and his wife had almost become strangers to each other. So let's continue the story. Glamis Castle was woken in the grey light of the dawn voices by the voices shouting, "Murder! The king is slain!" Shocked guests ran from their rooms and spoke in whispers. Who could have murdered the king? Rumours flew through the castle like swallows, and suspicion fell on Malcolm and Donald Blaine, who had the most to gain from their father's death. Malcolm and Donald Blaine were convinced that Macbeth was the murderer, but they did not dare to accuse him. Who would believe that the hero of the battle against the Norwegians would slay his own king? Though they knew it would be taken as proof of their guilt, Duncan's sons fled for their lives. Donald Blaine sailed for Ireland, and Malcolm rode across the border into England to put himself under the protection of the English king. Now nothing stood between Macbeth and the throne. He was crowned, but the crown did not bring him the pleasure he had imagined. His secret dream had come true, but he was disturbed by other dreams. Dreams of what the witches had foretold for Banquo's descendants. Hopefully you can remember that the witches had said that Banquo's sons would become king. And now as Macbeth is king, how is Banquo's sons going to become the king? Carrying on. Have I lied and murdered to set Banquo's spawn on the throne? He brooded. I must find a way to rid myself of him and his son. A dark plan formed in Macbeth's mind, and he kept it a secret, even from Lady Macbeth. Without either of them realising, the strange force that had compelled them to kill Duncan was slowly driving them apart. Macbeth held a coronation feast in the royal castle of Dunsinane. Dunsinane? I don't know how to say that word. Dunsinane. Many of the nobles who attended remarked that Macbeth's old friend Banquo was not present, but Macbeth laughed when they mentioned it. He said, Lord Banquo and his son must have been delayed on their way, he said lightly. Only he knew what had delayed them, for he had hired two murderers to ambush them on the road. At the height of the feast, a servant brought Macbeth a message that two men wished to see him on urgent business. Macbeth hurried to his private chambers and found the murderers there waiting for him. Have you done what I paid you to do? Macbeth demanded. Banquo is dead, my lord, one of the murderers said. We cut his throat and threw the body into a ditch. Macbeth sighed with relief. It's quite gory, this story. Perhaps now he would sleep peacefully. But then he sensed something wrong. Neither of them, the murderers, would look at him, and they kept anxiously shuffling their feet. And his son? Said Macbeth. The reply was shattering. He escaped, my lord. Banquo's son still lives. As he returned to the banqueting hall, doubts tortured Macbeth like scorpion stings. Banquo's son still lives, he thought. Lives to take his revenge on me, to claim the throne and father sons who will rule after him. Is there no end to the blood that must be shed before I find peace? As he entered the hall, Macbeth put on a false smile to hide his troubled mind, but the smile froze when he saw a hooded figure seated in his chair. "Who dares to sit in my place?" he roared. The guests fell silent and looked bewildered, because the king's chair was empty. "Why, no one, my lord," said Lady Macbeth with a forced laugh. She could see that something was wrong with her husband, but she could not guess what. "The king is jesting," she told the nobles. "This is no jest," barked Macbeth. He strolled angrily towards the figure, then recoiled in horror as it drew back its hood. For what he saw was Banquo, with weed tangled in his hair and mud streaked across his face and a deep gash in his neck that sent a stream of blood pattering onto the stones and haunting glassy eyes that stared and stared. "Get rid of him!" Macbeth screeched. The nobles sprang to their feet, drawing their daggers, knocking over chairs and wine and cups in the confusion. "Back to your grave!" sobbed Macbeth. Banquo smiled. There was blood in his mouth and his teeth shone white through it, and then he faded into the shadows and into the torchlight. "My lords, the king is ill," Lady Macbeth said desperately. "Leave us now and let him rest. In the morning he will be himself again." "Myself?" Macbeth moaned softly to himself. "I will not be myself again until Banquo's spirit is laid to rest. Only the witches can set me free." And we're going to stop there. So, what you are going to be doing, like I said, you are going to look at the 7 main events that I think have happened so far, and they're listed here just below me. And you are going to write down each one as like a heading, and then underneath it you're going to put 2 subtitles, and you're going to write, how did Macbeth react during that event, and what does this tell us about Macbeth? So I've done the first one as an example for us, okay? So for that first event, Macbeth meets the witches. What I've said is, this is the kind of thing that I would look you to do for the other ones too, okay? So you would say, you'd write the title, Event 1, Macbeth meets the witches, then you do a little subheading, how does Macbeth react? And then what I've said is, Macbeth has just come out of the battle when he meets the witches. At first he reaches for his sword, but then he stops. He questions what the witches have said. And then what does this tell us about Macbeth? Well, I think this shows us that Macbeth is quite a violent man, if the first thing he did was reach for his sword. And it also shows us that he's good friends with Banquo, and that he's not easily scared. He wasn't terrified by these witches, was he? So your job is to do this for the other tasks, okay, for the other 7 events. So what is it that Macbeth does? A bit more detail about what Macbeth does in each of these situations. Okay, and then what does that tell us about Macbeth at that point in the story? And at different points, because obviously after event 1, I was saying Macbeth he becomes quite a brave and honest person. Obviously, as the story goes on, he's not that at all. So year 6, work hard with this. I'll explain it a little bit more in the Zoom meeting for the morning and answer any questions. Okay, but give it a good go. I appreciate this is quite a big chunk of writing by the time you've done it for the 7 different events, but I know we can do it. Okay? Work hard, year 6, and I will see you in a bit.